Okay, good morning. Thank you for hanging in for day 2. My name is Thomas Ye. I work for NYSERDA as a consultant and technical advisor in the Energy Analytics Incentive Program. We call that program Real-Time Energy Management, or RTEM, just because we're government and we like to create new acronyms. So RTEM is the shorthand for our Energy Analytics Program. NYSERDA is, to those of you who are not familiar with it, is also an acronym. Stands for New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. As the name implies, we are an authority of New York State. NYSERDA promotes energy efficiency and renewable energy use in the state of New York. Sometimes I joke we're the Department of Energy for New York State. Now all states have an authority structure like NYSERDA, so I would understand that we may be new to some of you. NYSERDA administers many incentive programs targeting at residential, multifamily, commercial, and industrial customers. Of course, New York also have utilities that operates programs that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. But NYSERDA have a different role. We tend to run programs that are more strategic, what we call the capacity building in the marketplace. And the Energy Analytics Program is such a program that I'm here to share with you today. Also, my presentation is all about the impact of energy analytics on existing buildings. So I won't be addressing new constructions today. So the material that this slide covers will be mostly relevant to those of you interested or are working in energy management projects, including retro-commissioning and monitor-based commissioning. So, you know by now, the session is eligible to receive CES credits. You're also aware this is copyrighted material, so treat them accordingly. You must have seen the course description or you would not have been here, especially at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I won't bother repeating. So the learning objective also matches the sequence of today's slides. If you want credit for this, remember to check in on your app. First, we'll explain what we mean by energy analytics, and then we'll also quickly go over the energy analytic use cases by building owners and property managers that we have found in New York. Next, we will compare the cost of adopting energy analytics by a building's age, square footage, building functions ranging from office, retail, hospitality, and multifamily, and by various mechanical systems that's in the building. Afterward, we will look at energy conservation measures, or ECMs, identified by the energy analytics. That really is the purpose of installing energy analytics, that is to find ECM. Lastly, we'll go over a top 10 list of operational deficiencies that energy analytics is especially applicable at eliminating in our program. So first, let's clarify acronym. RTEM, or Real-Time Energy Management, was coined by NYSERDA back in 2016. Nonetheless, there were and still are many industry acronyms for similar platforms. For example, DOE and the national labs use EMIS, or Energy Management and Information System, to revert to what in New York we call it RTEM. There's some little differences that I will mention shortly. The diagram on this page is actually the one we borrow from in LB&L report. They're really good at making infographics. Now, you may also have heard of intelligent building systems, continuous commissioning systems, fault detection in diagnostic systems, automated system optimization platforms, and so on. In the terminology of today's presentation, they're all basically a subset of real-time energy management, meaning we offer incentive for all of those capabilities. I've already mentioned retro-commissioning and monitor-based commissioning systems that also falls under RTEM. So now, we use RTEM to really refer to describe a system of hardware, software, and cloud computing that continuously streams data, we call it real time, into a persistent repository in the cloud. So it's not like a typical control system historian that sits on the chief engineer's desk or under his desk. Analytic algorithm then process and extract actionable insights from the building data. Now, all part of the data extraction are included in our definition and therefore are eligible to receive our incentive. From the diagram, you can see the data repository in the various analytics according to RTEM must reside in the cloud. Now, we use the term cloud fairly often, so I'll just mention in our usage of the cloud, what we mean is enterprise class data center. So rather than, so what's the alternative? Again, a desktop unit or a laptop unit that's running the algorithms locally, on-prem, within the four walls. Now, the high-level category of energy analytics are on the right side of, on your right of this diagram. And you'll notice that the cloud repository and the energy analytics have a little cloud symbols around it. That's really how we differentiate from other definitions. Now it may seem like, gee, is there any other way of doing this? But back in 2016, we got a lot of pushbacks. Certainly cybersecurity is one, but that's through our everything. And it's really, many times, a cloud-based system is actually better protected than an on-prem system. You ever see somebody collecting data and doing email on the system? Then you'll know. So we're talking about essentially four element of energy analytics, starting with visualizing the data in a meaningful way. Now, that's not just a trend data. Of course, it includes trend data, but if just that is not a big deal. So things like a heat map is part of analytics, or real-time consumption comparing to a predicted consumption. So you know that you are operating as expected. Well, speaking of predictions, forecasting is the type of analytics. It can be done using traditional algorithms such as linear regression. We know that. Or it can also use machine learning algorithms such as a digital twin. A small subset of the solution provider in a program are deploying such form of machine learning in their analytics offerings. I can tell you those are very interesting. Regardless, these algorithms are often used for forecasting. Now, fault detection and diagnostic may be the one that most of you are familiar with in terms of energy analytics, and it is certainly part of it. I call that the modern version of alarming, but compare FDD to alarming is kind of like comparing in my age, a landline phone to a cell phone. So I know many of you probably never have to work with a landline phone. So FDD provides specificity as far as the cause of an alarm. So it's not just tell you high water or high water temperature, high zone temperature, but trying to detect the cause of the fault. Finally, automated system optimization is one of the most exciting analytics that we did not have, certainly in just a few years ago. Now, we may have a slightly different definition compared to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in terms of what they call an ASO, or Automated System Optimization. The term automated does not mean a system such as, let's say, a central plant chiller automatically schedule its own runtime. For example, we define automated as an analytic algorithm capable of autonomously identifying optimized operating parameters. For example, what are the proper startup and turn-down time of a central plant chiller to shorten the run hour but still satisfy the comfort parameters. In this example, the algorithm will recommend the times to start up and ramp down, but the on-site engineers may still need to execute the control sequences due to standard operating procedures, or in New York, we have local law that actually, for a certain size of machine, that require you to do that. Now, this slide also tells you what are some of the numerous benefits. People don't do it just because it's a good idea. These are, let's start with improving net operating incomes from utility savings. Tenants log fewer comfort complaints. Building operators have real-time visibility of the building systems, whether they're in the building, running around throughout the building, or away from the building. Also, one of the productivity benefits is having equipment conditions and outcome of the analytics available on their mobile devices. That we have seen is one of the more popular use cases. Now, building owners have told us that their building engineers are more productive since they have adopted energy analytics. We also have heard many building engineers really just chasing alarms all day, and energy analytics is really trying to make their lives easier. So this slide reviews the widespread use cases we have cataloged from real-world projects. I won't read these to you, but really I just want to point out that the non-energy use cases, which is actually toward the bottom, may play a very significant role in convincing building owners about the efficacy of analytics, so they should spend money. It's also important to mention that analytics use cases integrates well with well-known building operations. They're not forcing, by adopting analytics, building engineers and managers have to do something new or unfamiliar. They may be skeptical, but they're going about their day essentially more or less the same. The most significant advancement is that data and analytics forms the basis of scheduling, sequencing, and optimizing control set points of various building equipment and plants. I've gotten used to going into various buildings and ask, how do you come up with sequencing, scheduling, and setting set points? Many of them hasn't changed since the building was originally commissioned, probably by one of you folks, which is a little scary considering many buildings participating in the program are over 50 years old. In New York City, where bulk of the square footage participating in the program resides, the buildings have gone through improvements for more than a decade outside of our program. And New York City have a local law that requires building over 50,000 square feet to be audited and retro-commissioned every 10 years, starting in 2009. Now, many buildings are going into their second decade or second rounds of audits and being recommissioned. It's really keeping a lot of consultants employed. But because of that, many of these buildings that are installing energy analytics have taken advantage of our incentive, already have many of the low-hanging fruit issue fixed. But energy analytics still have to demonstrate efficacy. So I won't stay in this slide very long. This slide is just offer you some comfort that we have gathered data to present to you. We funded over 1,100 buildings throughout New York State between 2016 and 2021, Cumulatively, the program impacted over 300 million square feet of building spaces. In addition, NYSERDA essentially spent over 75 million of incentives. We actually started the funding at 30 million, had to double it just because of the popularity, and generated over 236 million of direct private investments. This came from a dashboard. You can actually find that online. And most of the program square footage is located on your lower right, which is in New York City. This slide demonstrates the program's impact by ranking the participation of commercial building owners and impact their square footage. We launched our RTEM program in 2016. Initially, we had to go through market education, meaning we had to convince the various stakeholders from consultant to owners that by answering questions like, what are energy analytics? Why my building need it? Don't I already have it since I pay hundreds of $1,000s for that control system upgrade? And I have something called EMS. I don't use, but my engineer tells me that it's managing energy. So actually, the truth be told, not until very recently, none of those systems offer very much in the form of analytics. That is changing. The chart on your left illustrates the square footage of the commercial sector that installed RTEM or energy analytics systems. You may recognize, if you have better eyes than I do, many notable commercial real estate companies that own and operate buildings. The ownership with the most extensive square footage in the program are Brookfield Properties, Empire State Realty Trust, and properties managed by JLL in New York. I trust that these names are not unfamiliar to you. Almost all of them start with a pilot project. They don't just say, hey, I want to adopt energy analytics in all of my buildings. And until they're convinced by the efficacy of the energy analytics, and then they adopt it across their portfolio. You may also recognize Vornado on the chart, Hines and SL Green with fewer sites and fewer square footage, but they're still in the pilot stage when we ran out of money. So they got a little mad at us. Fortunately, we did launch a second program, but I won't talk about that today. The chart on your right ranked participation by square footage of the highest site counts. So these are retail and food service operators having the highest number of sites adopting analytics. The top three are Planet Fitness with 34 sites, 5 Below with 22 sites, and Chipotle with 57 sites. These sites also, unsurprisingly, have some of the smallest square footage in the program. Some may be only a few thousand square feet. All of the systems installed at these little sites include control capabilities. So energy analytic doesn't just tell you what to do, but some of the systems for the small ones, in fact, all of them for the small one, also implement the control. This is because retail and food service stores do not have dedicated facility engineers or operators. The store staff and management. Can you imagine a store manager of 5 Below getting an alarm and saying, you really should set back your temperature after 10 o'clock? So most of these buildings are centrally administered and monitored by their corporate owners and purposely set up with limited local control. Like you may be able to adjust temperature by plus or minus 2 degrees. Some of them even you can push button, but nothing happens. Okay. Another way we evaluate the impact of the program is by the quantity and diversity of the solution providers actively participating. Since I didn't mention it before, we offer a cost share of 30%, only available through qualified suppliers. So over 5 years, we have recruited about 45 active solution providers. We call them program vendors. These vendors are multinational giants to mid-level companies. In addition, we also have startups that are fairly successful in the program. This chart ranked analytic platform market share in our program or in New York by square feet. These are platforms on the chart offered by well-known companies such as Siemens, Trane, and Schneider Electric. Also, there are homegrown platforms offered by technical service consultants or engineering firms such as Untitled and OTI. In addition, we also have several software startups ranked high in market share, including Cortex and Innovative. Perhaps you'll find it interesting, because I do, that the highest market share by square footage is SkySpark. Now, you won't find SkyFoundry as a vendor in our program because SkySpark is sold through value-added resellers, value-added developers, and OEMs. So although SkyFoundry is not directly in the program, more than half a dozen of their VARs, VADs, and OEMs are active in the program. This chart on your right ranks the system vendors by site count and square footage. I am confident that just about every significant energy analytics software in the market is involved in our program. Part of it is because I travel to expos like this one and recruit vendors to or folks that have a software solution provider to participate. The top 3 vendors ranked by square footage are Siemens, Cortex, and Utilizer. Remember, these are vendors, not platforms. Siemens is the giant and well-known throughout New York. I'm sure you heard of it. So perhaps Siemens earning the largest market share by square feet is not a big surprise. However, Cortex is very close to Siemens square footage, and they are a startup. That's one of my most satisfying findings is startup can be successful in competing with giants like Siemens. So this demonstrates that both multinational and startups can be successful if they deliver differentiated analytics. The chart on your left ranks market share by number of sites by vendors. So these are small sites. These are where small site counted the same as a skyscraper. The top 3 of these vendors are GridPoint at 72 sites, Dual Fuel, they were here yesterday, at 58 sites, and Trane at 57. So GridPoint is a company that specializes in small retails and food services. Dual Fuel site is almost all small apartment buildings. And Trane site consists of a range of buildings from K-12 schools to religious institutions. Okay. Now we're going to switch to talk about costs of adopting energy analytics. Now, energy analytics, or NYSERDA's term, RTEM, apply to a wide swath of properties. We are therefore uniquely positioned to look for patterns that affect metrics, such as costs of adopting energy analytics. Now, speaking of costs, we look for, in this page, a correlation between age of the building and cost of the projects. It may be intuitively obvious that older buildings cost more, or you would be wrong in our program. You can see the age distribution of the building participating in the program on the chart to your left. Most of the building participating or installing cloud-based analytics supported by our program are over 50 years old. However, we noted that the building's age has little effect on the project cost. Instead, what matters is whether the building's control system has been upgraded. Obsolete BAS and control system in older buildings will cost a lot more to implement cloud-based analytics. For example, although pneumatic controls may still be working, pneumatic system lacks data and needs substantial refit to provide the building data to drive the analytics. Some buildings that have been deferring the need for investment need to spend as high as $5 to $8 per square foot to modernize it, so real-time data can drive the analytics. On the other hand, installing analytics is often less than 50 cents per square foot, even for an older building if they have a relatively modern control system. Continuing with factors that impacting project costs, what may be unexpected is the building square foot and RTEM project costs are not strongly correlated in our data set. That one surprised me too. Usually we expect it would because we are used to bigger buildings having more points and cost more. That is undoubtedly true for building automation projects. We all have seen it. In the program, however, vendors pricing energy analytics by points are not popular. Rather, analytic systems with a flat charge have many more installations. That makes sense. If you think about it, because the level of effort to adopt analytics when the building's existing BAS system has a nice modern interface like BetNet or even Modbus, really is just require one connection to gather all the data points. So additional data sources like IoT sensors or meters are priced by integration difficulties, not by points. For commercial office building, our data shows 80% of the buildings have project costs less than or equal to 80 cents per square foot. That sounds like made-up number, doesn't it? Real number. In fact, over 40% have project costs of 30 cents per square foot or less. So at these prices, RTEM or energy analytics are very cost-effective. As we already mentioned, retail and hospitality sites are small properties and therefore tend to have higher costs on a per square foot basis, even though the absolute project costs are only a fraction of what's in large buildings. Also, as I mentioned before, energy analytics projects in these sites are really controls projects, meaning these systems will automate heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting for centralized administration. This slide shows the cost for multifamily sites. Multifamily projects ranges from a building with just a handful of residential unit to high-rise, high-density apartment complexes with hundreds or thousands of units. We observed that just over 50% of the project costs at $1 per square foot or less in these buildings. Many of these, especially smaller sites, also includes control because the building systems doesn't support data gathering. So we incentivize it, those have to be added, that add to the cost. Not really in the analytics, but you gotta get data. Mechanical systems are the most common building system monitored by analytics because in most projects, BAS and BMS are the primary data sources. Also, mechanical systems are the one that building owners identify as major energy users. The largest quantity are rooftop units, air handling units, and DX units. Now, DX and rooftop units are commonly part of higher project costs on a per square foot basis because they tend to be in smaller properties, retail, food service, or hospitality sites, or even smaller commercial buildings. On the other hand, analytics for air handling units, VAVs, and pumps tend to be lower cost projects on a per square foot basis because they tend to be part of a central plant. In large office buildings, bigger buildings have less cost per square foot if their building control or management system are relatively modern. So starting from this slide, we're moving from project costs to presenting the most prevalent energy conservation measures identified by the analytics. First of all, this is actually a surprise to my colleagues at the lab. 83% of energy conservation measures, or ECMs, are FDD and ASO measures. FDD, fault detection diagnostics, ASO are automated system optimization, according to our definition. The remaining 17% falls under a kind of a mixed bag. By the way, we consider an ECM when the analytics identify, hey, you don't have enough data for me to do a good job telling you what to do. And so we have seen where buildings over time have installed more sensors, more meters, more systems that can communicate data. So now we can extract a couple of findings from data on this slide. One is the FDD findings is less than in other studies, such as in LBNLs. Most of the square footage, remember I said that in our program is in New York City, and I told you that since 2009, Local Law 87 in New York mandated the building have to undergo every 10 years energy audit and retro commissioning study. Therefore, many buildings have fixed these obvious faults since 2009. Now, that is one explanation why we have fewer FDD measures. On the other hand, Local Law 87 does not address optimization. Very few, actually, program does. So the building can operate the central plants with longer run hour than necessary. Now, obviously, if something is running during unoccupied hours, as if it is occupied hours, will be found, but those are actually low-hanging fruit. But whether you should start up a chiller plant or a boiler plant at 4 o'clock compared to 6 o'clock, depending on weather, occupancy, day of the week, and a few other factors like where your building ended up before you start up the plant. That is what I'm referring to as optimization by taking in those other parameters. Okay. Now again, our definition of ASO does not require these analytics automatically affects the control system, because in New York, that's actually disallowed. So as long as the analytics automatically identifies what should be the operating parameters and make that available to the facility engineers, we consider that ASO. Now, finding, prioritizing, and validating ECMs are why many building owners choose to explore energy analytics. Also, most ECMs are related to buildings' HVAC equipment. Cooling equipment are at 59%, heating are at 22%, and ventilation at 6%. Now, in analyzing thousands of ECMs, I actually really enjoy reading those. I know it's a pretty geeky thing, but we notice that it falls under 5 types. By saying ASO and FDD, those are not everyday common terms. So we're trying to break it down into terms that's more familiar to building engineers, so this information can be more readily digested. So these 5s are changing set points, changing sequence and scheduling of plants or equipment, identifying parts and equipment that needs to be repaired or replaced. That is a very interesting measure. I know a big building in New York justified their energy analytic just because it found hundreds of leaking valves. They would not have found it because the control system was compensating for it. So there was no comfort complaints. So they were actually leaking hot water during the summertime. They had to make that up using chill water. Just that alone, a couple hundred leaking valves. Now that makes sense if you think about buildings are over 50 years old as an average in our building, in our program. Lastly, testing and balancing, or retesting and balancing for the folks in this room. And then adding sensors and meters, I already mentioned that. Okay. We also develop a top 10 list. Also, I'm not going to read this to you. You can go look this up, because whatever I read, you won't remember. But I do think that this top 10 list is an excellent checklist when you walk in an existing building. and for every facility manager to ask themselves whether their facility have these deficiencies also undiscovered. By the way, when I mentioned about the leaking valves, it's actually in a building that's very well run and is in a building that the building engineers and the property managers are very proud of their building. So, also, many of these deficiencies are not obvious if all you do is chasing tenant complaints. Tenants don't complain about these things. And many of these deficiencies reoccur after you think you fixed them. So it's not just a one-time fix. So you have to keep diligent to prevent repeated occurrences. I joke because I raised raised children, and it's kind of like yelling at them while they're driving, right? It's a repeated exercise, not a one-time thing, right? Telling them to stay within the speed limit is not a one-time ECM, right? Now we're going to quantify savings. We sample commercial and multifamily project to perform weather normalized IP and VP option C analysis. Everybody always like to say IP and VP, even though those things don't really tell you how to do things. For commercial projects, we observed 8.2% of annual electricity savings and 4.7% of non-electric savings, like steam and natural gas or oil. The combined fuel saving is 6.9%. In my mind, I just rounded up to 7% since that's easier for me to remember at my age. For multifamily projects, we observed 8.7% electric savings and 13.8% non-electric savings. Combine all the utility in both sector, the overall annual savings is about 72.2%. Now, before some of you start poo-pooing these findings, I will tell you on an average of 72%, some of the buildings can actually pay back energy analytic in months. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean every project has a 7% savings. Some have higher. Some have no and negative savings, and those negative savings I consider are actually some of the benefits of energy analytics. Meaning that after they install energy analytics, the building actually consumes more energy. You're like, geez, why did I do that? Well, I want to point out to you K-12 schools on this chart. You'll notice an example of negative saving. This is a one-year result. We noticed, I gotta speed up. We noticed two behavior patterns for K-12 schools in particular. In the first year, the analytics tend to uncover many non-compliance issues at the schools. Surprise, surprise. Measures like stuck dampers below the design ventilation of the building, fans not producing the rated ECM, CFMs, or broken valves, like I mentioned before, that left some space unconditioned. You think fan coil is open, that valve is opening. It's not. So these are essentially undiscovered until the energy analytics. So you can think about that as kind of like retro commissioning, right? Except it's going to do it every day. So these are obvious priority. You got to get them fixed. And the result is K-12 schools with higher consumption to be compliant. Another issue we notice is some school facility staff tend not to follow recommendations of the analytics because they feel like they know better than some computer telling them what to do. So I don't know how many times when I was talking to the system provider, they go, yeah, our biggest ECM is system keep getting put into manual mode. Sometimes it takes a year or two to work these staff issues out. Some of them really, you wait until the staff is retired before it's fixed. So that explains some of the negative savings. But like I said before, those are valuable ECMs. Okay. Now, let's put everything together and talk about case studies. Everybody always talk about case studies. One of my favorite energy analytics projects is at the Empire State Building. Empire State Realty Trust owns the building, and they are one of the most progressive building owners in making thoughtful upgrades. They also have very knowledgeable staff who are impressive thought leaders. I don't have to tell you that the building is on the older side since it was constructed in 1931. This chart shows Empire State Building's electric demand on an August day. The gray silhouette represents the typical low profile for this day. That it by itself is a type of analytics. The green curve is the electric profile after implementing some 9 ECMs identified by the analytics. We won't go over every analytics in the interest of time, but they're listed there. And please download the slide deck if you want to know further. But I will spotlight several for your attention. Measure 1 delays the startup of the building's central cooling plant by around an hour. Gee, is that a big deal? The gap between the two profiles shows the saving from this measure. The next one I want to bring to your attention is measure 3, which recommends increased chill water temperature outside of the occupied schedules. You call that setback, I suppose. And measure 4, which recommend reducing the speed of the chiller pump overnight. These 3 measures optimize the run hour and lower the central cooling plant's consumption when the building did not need it. So collectively, these are a great example of analytics that can find saving without impacting comfort. Now, there are several other analytics. Stop overcooling the building spaces, for example, and intentionally staging chillers to avoid setting a new electric peak demand due to coincidental operations, traditionally a very difficult ECM to implement, right? Because those are automated to operate chill water temperatures in New York, a new demand peak. Most commercial office buildings, demand charges account for 50%, up to 50% of their utility bill. So keep in mind, Empire State Building is already well run, but still found these opportunities because of the analytics can incorporate many more variables than even a good human operator like the one that worked on the Empire State Building can factor into their day-to-day decisions. Now, the Empire State Building is heated using steam. The steam is supplied by a district system operated by Con Edison of New York. Many of you may know that Con Edison operates the largest steam network in the country. The analytic also identifies steam opportunities, although steam is not generated at the building. So instead, steam consumption is modulated by adjusting steam pressures at various times of the day. The savings from implementing measures identified by the analytics at the Empire State Building generate an annual utility spending reduction of about 12%, normalized. Again, that may not sound big, but for Empire State Building, 12% equals over $1.2 million of savings for an already well-run building. $1.2 million pay back the initial analytic installment cost in weeks. So now I choose to highlight Empire State Building because it's such a marquee building, and clearly energy benefit is not just good at iconic buildings. Instead, our program finds most facilities can justify adoption by the savings and non-energy benefits. There are 3 more case studies. I picked these 3 because they provide handy comparisons. When you get the slide, you'll be able to see the numbers in more detail. All 3 projects cost $200,000. The first 2 projects are commercial office buildings with similar vintage but have a 10x difference in square footage. 250,000 square foot compared to 2.5 million square foot. Additionally, the first project included occupancy counting as a critical data element. It is integrated with the building's access control system down in the lobby, which allowed the analytics to identify optimization opportunities taking into account real-time occupancy of the building. So as a result, we observed 30% annual normalized savings. The second project did not include occupancy counting. Nonetheless, the analytics still find optimization opportunities, which results in a 20% annual normalized savings. Now, again, that level of savings is impressive. Yes, it is, especially if you consider the utility cost of a 2.5 million square foot building. So, the interesting about these two is you can anecdotally compare the value of adding occupancy counting in the optimization algorithm leads to something in the order of 10% savings. And the interesting part about that is that 10% saving came from ramping down the chiller plant essentially during the lunchtime hours. And because people leave the building for lunch and started back up, ran back up when folks come back into the building. And then when people leave the building, especially on a Friday, this is where Big Brother comes in. You know, people start leaving not at 5 o'clock like they do maybe on a Wednesday, but at 3 o'clock, which you can then start to ramp down the building before you find the changes in the temperature, because as we all know, there is a delay. So this is kind of like feed-forward control by having occupancy counting. So, okay, let's bring it to a close. First, you should know that we categorize all the energy analytics into fault detection or diagnostics or automated system optimization or ASO, FDDs and ASO. Next, we identify the lowest cost of adopting energy analytics is by overlaying on top of the building's automation or energy management systems. So building without BIS, EMS would choose not to integrate, which there are buildings that choose not to integrate, must then install purposeful sensors and meters to acquire data for analytics, and there are those type of systems. But they tend to have higher overall costs. We also notice higher overall cost projects involving the need to upgrade a building's automation or control system. I think many of you are familiar with older BIS that have a bandwidth issue when you're pulling data for analytics. So we also incentivize buildings to upgrade their servers and their network so they won't have these bandwidth issues. A good one would be switching from Modbus serial to Modbus IP or BACnet MSTP to BACnet IP. Still, typical project cost is less than $1 per square foot. Over 40% of office buildings, less than 30 cents per square foot. When combined as a portfolio, we calculated 7.2%. I'm sorry, I didn't have enough coffee. Savings. And by the way, that 7.2% savings only account for only 1/3 of the ECM identified by the building analytics were implemented in the first year. So that leaves 2/3 of the ECMs that can't be implemented. Not all the ECMs you identify, as you can imagine, can be readily implemented, especially the one that causes interruption to tenants. So they take time. So 1/3 of the implementation in the first year equals to 7.2% savings with more saving. Now, how many measures, how many improvements you think you can do in a building that increase savings over time? Lastly, perhaps more importantly, we want to share that perhaps energy analytics wins over building owners because their energy saving efficacies, depending on how aggressive these owners are in evaluating analytics. So they tend to first fund a project in a handful of buildings. But owners would also identify many non-energy benefits doing these pilot projects. And many have told us that it is these non-energy benefits like fewer tenant complaints and building operators are more productive. Owners will then see these as reason to move the energy analytics across their portfolio. So thank you very much for your attention. My email address is here. For however time we have left, I will be happy to entertain your questions. Should I just have them speak up loud?
I think it's a small enough room where.
Okay, go ahead.
So in your review and effort through the program, do you have some insight into, on the 1/3 of ECMs that were implemented, what the simple payback for some of those buildings might be?
Yeah, as you can imagine that by the way, the simple payback across, if we look at just a commercial office building, is less than 2 years. Okay, when they don't have to upgrade their building control system. Now, when they do have to upgrade the building control system, you can imagine that's a longer upgrade. In fact, for many buildings, you can't actually calculate a payback for a control system upgrade. But the way that we see it is that actually increased the savings potential, because now they have a modern control system, DDC, as compared to an older. In New York, wasn't so long ago, you walk around, you still see a lot of pneumatic systems. Okay, so generally for office buildings, we see less than 2-year payback. In some cases, if you find one of these ECM that even after the retro commissioning and the auditing are still kind of leak through, like a replacing 200. By the way, that replacing 200 valve took 2 years, but the payback once they're done is in weeks, because they've been doing simultaneous heating and cooling. They never knew it. The one over there, and then I'll come here.
Did you say that in New York you're not allowed to have the analytics change the program?
Smaller buildings like a 5 below or something like that. I don't know, do you have 5 below here? Or a Texas row house or a McDonald. I know you have McDonald here. Those you can. Big buildings, 1 million square foot with, it's go by the size of the system. So, 1,000-ton equivalent chillers or, very large boiler plants. You actually need a person there. This is why during COVID, while they actually trying to condition the buildings, never mind the wasteful part of it, but just to keep the building without dehumidify, without creating mold and those issues, you still need building operator in these buildings just to meet those requirements. It's mechanical code. Other question here?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
We have done some local law 87 work. At this time, and that was a few years back, this time is RTEM a part of that?
Yes. Building, that's another reason. It's kind of, again, it's hard to justify, payback from something like that. But yes, the data, the work that was done before, I'm sure you remember, just running around and collect data took forever. Something you would think is trivial, but no. But so now a lot of time building owners you still need a third party to do it, but now you just provide them a login to your energy analytics systems.
And I have 2 questions.
Sure.
We also do a lot of healthcare work, and I looked at the EUIs on it, and it's obviously very high.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any particular findings in healthcare that you found in particular?
Essentially, the healthcare measures are not all that different than the other than big buildings for this reason. The healthcare actually don't want to touch their patient space. So most of the upgrades are actually were done in the central plants. And so in that case, these are central plant upgrades that you can think about. Question here?
This is a little bit corollary to what you've been talking about, but I'm curious because you look at such big data sets. Do you see a common thing with building owners and how they design their lease arrangements with their tenants to make sure they're recouping the savings?
Yeah, lease is a big deal in New York right now. Some of you may hear the local law 97, where we basically, New York has a very high, or can be very high, carbon tax penalty on building that doesn't meet certain carbon use intensity. You heard of EUI in New York. Now building owners are thinking in terms of carbon use intensity, meaning tons per square foot. And some of those penalties can be very high if you don't meet it. Now, some buildings really require significant upgrade, more than just their internal system like envelopes. You imagine upgrading the envelopes of a 70 storage building? It's like, just change out windows. Oh, just add a little insulation. I was like, okay, these are incredibly complicated work. So now they're trying to figure out how to incorporate some of that. Our new program, it's a chance for me to pitch, is actually geared toward extending energy management into tenant spaces. Because tenants, it's like, how do you convince tenant? We're going to disrupt your space. We're going to, we may charge you more for energy, all this stuff. But it's, it's good stuff. They want to actually see data. Actually, you'd be amazed on how difficult it is for tenants to see data. They get a bill, but they don't see data. Okay, so we actually want to incentivize adding analytics into tenant spaces so they can see data. Imagine if in the lease you're scheduled to meet a certain comfort condition by 7, but you can show them that the occupancy doesn't start until 9. Well, why are you conditioning the building for an extra 2 hours? There's space. Okay, that's a optimization measure that we really encourage, and it's otherwise difficult to do. You make it anecdotal thing. There's nobody in this space. Okay, but it's hard to be very rigorous about it. Well, did they have somebody in that space last month? That's at 8 o'clock in the morning. So therefore we have to do this. You go back and you look at the occupancy data. You say no. There's the earliest I've seen you have in this space is 8:45. So can I condition your space to 8:30? That one measure alone in some of the big buildings, delay 1 hour, is 7% savings, 6% saving, delay 1 hour.
Yeah, sure, I'll ask
Okay. Only 1 minute, so.
How are you tracking, what are you seeing are the best ways to track occupancy?
There is probably a half a dozen of the system out there. We have seen integrating with the turnstile systems. Okay, that's one. That's already there, just integrated. Pull the data out. We've seen camera-based systems. We've seen LiDAR-based systems. We've seen camera, LiDAR. We've seen integration with lighting control. One of the interesting things about occupancy counting that is not usually think about it in terms of energy is actually a system made for workspace management. Now people are trying to hot desking. Well, to do something like that, you need to monitor your occupancy of your workspace. Okay, so you can assign desk when somebody shows up. Those type of systems have occupancy counting in there. So by us incentivized on the integration, we take advantage of that data into energy analytics. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'll be here for a few more minutes.